Captain Marcus Webb stood before the holographic display aboard the UES Defiance, watching as 12 massive alien dreadnoughts materialized from hyperspace, their sleek obsidian hulls bristling with weapons that could reduce planets to ash. The Zephyrian Council had finally come to claim Earth, just as their ultimatum had promised 6 months ago. Webb's weathered hands traced over the ancient leather-bound book resting on his command console, Sun Tzu's The Art of War, a relic his grandfather had salvaged from the ruins of old Beijing during the Resource Wars. The alien vessels, each one 10 times larger than his modest frigate, arranged themselves in perfect formation, their commanders likely confident that humanity would surrender without a fight, just as the Kepler colonies had done, just as the mining stations on Europa had capitulated when faced with similar overwhelming force. But Webb had spent years studying not just the Zephyrians' advanced tactics, but the forgotten strategies of Earth's greatest military minds, from Alexander the Great to Hannibal, from Miyamoto Musashi to Napoleon Bonaparte. The Council's Admiral Zektar materialized as a towering hologram on Webb's bridge, his crystalline features radiating the cold arrogance typical of his species, demanding immediate surrender and the handover of Earth's governmental control to Zephyrian oversight, claiming that humanity's primitive aggression made them unfit for self-governance in the galactic community. Webb calmly requested a standard parley period of 72 hours, citing ancient galactic law that even the advanced Zephyrians couldn't dismiss without losing face among other Council species, knowing that his enemy's honor-bound culture would force them to comply despite their technological superiority. As the alien fleet settled into a blockade formation around Earth, their sensors no doubt cataloging every human military asset, Webb activated encrypted communications with resistance cells he'd been quietly coordinating across the solar system for months, each one led by officers who'd studied the same ancient texts, who understood that sometimes the old ways could confound the new. The Zephyrians had conquered 47 worlds using their standard doctrine of overwhelming technological force combined with surgical precision strikes, but they'd never encountered an enemy who understood that true warfare wasn't about superior weapons or faster ships, but about deception, misdirection, and the willingness to sacrifice pieces to capture the king. Webb opened his grandfather's book to a page he'd memorized long ago, where Sun Tzu wrote about appearing weak when strong and strong when weak, about using the enemy's expectations against them, about victory before the first shot was fired. The Zephyrian fleet maintained their perfect formation, their commanders probably reviewing tactical data on human military capabilities, dismissing Earth's small fleet of outdated vessels as negligible threats, unaware that Webb had spent 2 years studying every recorded engagement between Zephyrian forces and other species, identifying patterns in their strategies, weaknesses in their thinking, gaps in their otherwise formidable defenses. As Earth's 24-hour cycle began to turn toward night on the North American continent, Webb initiated Phase 1 of his carefully planned campaign, sending out what appeared to be random civilian evacuation ships from major population centers, vessels that the Zephyrian censors would dismiss as frightened refugees fleeing the coming occupation, not recognizing that each ship carried specially trained crews and equipment that would prove crucial in the days ahead. The art of war, as his grandfather had taught him, wasn't about fighting the battle your enemy expected, but about creating an entirely different kind of conflict, one where their advantages became liabilities and their certainties became doubts that would ultimately destroy them from within. Webb watched Admiral Zektar's hologram flicker with barely contained irritation as the 72-hour deadline approached, the alien commander clearly expecting humanity to surrender rather than face annihilation, his crystalline features betraying the first signs of impatience that Webb had been counting on since their initial communication. The Zephyrian fleet maintained their textbook blockade formation, each massive dreadnought positioned with mathematical precision around Earth's orbital plane, their weapons arrays powered but not yet locked onto targets, a display of overwhelming force designed to break human morale before the first shot was fired. Webb had spent the previous day and night appearing to frantically coordinate Earth's defenses, broadcasting encrypted military communications that he knew the Zephyrians would intercept and decode, painting a picture of a desperate humanity preparing for a hopeless last stand with their inferior technology and tiny fleet of aging warships. The reality was far different. Every seemingly panicked transmission had been carefully crafted to reinforce Zektar's preconceptions about human military doctrine, feeding the alien admiral's natural arrogance while concealing the true scope of Webb's preparations. Lieutenant Jackson reported from the communications station that the last of the civilian evacuation transports had reached their designated coordinates throughout the solar system, each ship broadcasting standard distress beacons and refugee manifestos that made them appear like helpless noncombatants fleeing the coming battle, when in truth they were the key components of a strategy that combined elements from every major Earth military victory in recorded history. Webb's fingers traced another passage in his grandfather's book, this one describing how Scipio Africanus had defeated Hannibal himself by studying the Carthaginians' own tactics and turning them against their creator, a lesson that seemed particularly relevant as he prepared to use the Zephyrians' technological superiority as the very instrument of their downfall. The Alien Council had made a critical error in their intelligence gathering, focusing solely on humanity's space-based military assets while dismissing Earth's industrial capacity and the ingenuity that had allowed humans to colonize hostile worlds with nothing but determination and recycled equipment from failed corporate ventures. Admiral Zektar's voice crackled through the holographic projector as he delivered what was clearly intended as a final ultimatum, his words dripping with the condescension that Webb had observed in every recorded Zephyrian communication with species they considered inferior, demanding immediate capitulation and threatening to demonstrate their weapons capabilities on one of Earth's orbital stations if humanity continued this pointless defiance. Webb responded with exactly the tone Zektar expected to hear, a mixture of false bravado and barely concealed desperation, accepting the alien admiral's challenge while secretly activating a series of ancient Earth communication protocols that his scattered refugee ships had been waiting to receive. The Zephyrian sensors were undoubtedly powerful enough to detect energy signatures and weapon systems, but they weren't designed to recognize the significance of seemingly random electromagnetic pulses that matched patterns used by Earth's maritime forces centuries ago, signals that would have looked like background radiation to alien technology calibrated for more advanced civilizations. As the final hours of the deadline ticked away, Webb allowed himself a small smile, remembering his grandfather's stories about the Pacific Theater in World War II, where American forces had used their enemies' assumptions about Western military thinking to achieve victory after victory against supposedly superior Japanese naval strategy. The Zephyrian Council had studied humanity's recent conflicts, their analysts no doubt convinced they understood how humans would respond to overwhelming force, but they had never encountered an enemy who had preserved and studied the military wisdom of ages past, tactics that predated their own civilization by millennia. Webb's tactical display showed friendly contacts moving into position throughout the solar system, each one masquerading as something harmless while carrying the tools needed to prove that sometimes the oldest strategies were the most effective ones, especially when applied by people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from thinking beyond the boundaries of conventional space warfare. The first phase of Webb's deception began to unfold as the refugee ships reached their predetermined positions throughout the solar system, each one activating ancient Earth stealth technology that the Zephyrian sensors dismissed as primitive electromagnetic interference, unaware that humanity had spent decades perfecting techniques originally developed for submarine warfare during Earth's 20th century conflicts. Commander Lisa Rodriguez aboard the disguised transport vessel New Horizon watched her instruments carefully as she maneuvered her ship behind Jupiter's largest moon, using gravitational shadows and naturally occurring radiation fields to mask her vessel's true capabilities, while simultaneously deploying a network of microsatellites that appeared on Zephyrian sensors as nothing more than space debris. Webb had studied the Battle of Midway extensively, understanding how Admiral Nimitz had used intelligence and deception to turn a numerically superior Japanese fleet into a tactical disaster, and he was now applying those same principles on an interplanetary scale, using the Zephyrians' advanced technology against them by exploiting their inability to recognize truly ancient strategies. The Alien Council's flagship, a massive vessel called the Eternal Dominion, continued broadcasting demands for immediate surrender, Admiral Zektar's holographic image growing more imperious with each transmission as he clearly expected the primitive humans to capitulate in the face of overwhelming technological superiority. What Zektar couldn't know was that each of Webb's refugee vessels was equipped with mining equipment repurposed from the asteroid belt colonies, tools that could tunnel through solid rock and ice with surgical precision, now modified to serve as the foundation for a strategy that combined elements from the Siege of Troy, Hannibal's crossing of the Alps, and the guerrilla tactics used by resistance fighters throughout Earth's bloody history. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, positioned aboard a transport near the outer rim of Saturn's rings, began deploying what appeared to be standard emergency shelters on several of the planet's smaller moons, structures that Zephyrian long-range scans would classify as refugee camps for displaced civilians, when in reality they were carefully concealed weapons platforms designed using principles from medieval castle defense systems adapted for the vacuum of space. Webb had spent months studying Zephyrian tactical doctrine, learning that their commanders relied heavily on centralized command structures and real-time sensor data to coordinate their fleets, making them vulnerable to the kind of distributed, decentralized attacks that had served human guerrilla forces well throughout history, from the American Revolution to the resistance movements of occupied Europe during the Second World War. The beauty of his plan lay in its fundamental simplicity. While the Zephyrians were scanning for advanced weapon signatures and sophisticated military technology, they were completely blind to threats that operated on principles their civilization had abandoned millennia ago, assuming that any species capable of interstellar travel would naturally adopt their own preference for overwhelming technological force applied with surgical precision. Captain David Torres, commanding a converted cargo hauler near the asteroid belt, activated his ship's mining lasers under the pretense of clearing debris from his planned escape route, when in fact he was carefully positioning metallic fragments that would serve the same function as the caltrops used by ancient armies to disrupt cavalry charges, except these obstacles were designed to interfere with the Zephyrians' faster-than-light jump calculations. Admiral Zektar's confidence was evident in every communication, his crystalline features radiating the same arrogance that Webb had observed in historical accounts of commanders who had underestimated their enemies, from Crassus facing Spartacus to Custer approaching the Little Bighorn, leaders who had allowed their technological or numerical advantages to blind them to the fundamental unpredictability of desperate adversaries fighting on familiar ground. The Zephyrian fleet began making minor adjustments to their formation, their computers automatically compensating for what their sensors interpreted as random gravitational anomalies and electromagnetic fluctuations caused by the fleeing civilian ships, unaware that every apparent coincidence was actually part of a carefully orchestrated plan designed to funnel them into an engagement where their advantages would become liabilities. Webb opened his grandfather's book to a passage about patience and timing, remembering Sun Tzu's wisdom about winning victories before battles were fought, about using the enemy's strength against them by making them believe they were following their own strategic doctrine when in fact they were dancing to a tune composed by someone who understood that the art of war was fundamentally unchanged whether fought with bronze swords or plasma cannons. The countdown timer on his command console showed less than 6 hours remaining until Zektar's deadline, and Webb knew that soon the Zephyrian admiral would make the first move that would begin his own destruction, initiating an attack against what he believed were Earth's primary defenses while remaining completely unaware that the real battle would be fought according to rules that predated his entire civilization. Admiral Zektar realized too late that the human evacuation had been a massive feint as Webb's forces struck simultaneously at 12 different points across the solar system, the carefully orchestrated attacks beginning precisely at the moment when the Zephyrian commander had expected to receive humanity's formal surrender, his crystalline features contorting with shock as sensor reports flooded his command center with impossible readings. The first strike came from Commander Rodriguez near Jupiter, where her refugee transport suddenly revealed itself as a heavily modified mining vessel, its industrial cutting beams slicing through the escorts of the Zephyrian heavy cruiser Silent Judgment with surgical precision, targeting not the ships themselves but their communication arrays and sensor clusters, effectively blinding the alien vessels while leaving their crews alive but helpless. Webb watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction as reports streamed in from across the solar system, each attack following the same pattern that Alexander the Great had used against the Persian Empire, striking simultaneously at multiple points to prevent coordinated response while focusing on disrupting command and control rather than attempting to destroy superior forces through direct confrontation. Captain Torres activated his hidden weapons platforms throughout the asteroid belt, revealing that his months of mining operations had actually been an elaborate construction project, installing kinetic bombardment systems that now launched precisely calculated volleys of metal fragments toward the Zephyrian fleet's predicted hyperspace exit points, creating invisible barriers that would tear apart any ship attempting to escape through faster-than-light travel. The beauty of Webb's strategy became apparent as Admiral Zektar frantically tried to re-establish communication with his scattered task forces, discovering that the primitive human tactics had effectively isolated each Zephyrian vessel from the others, turning their technological advantage into a liability by forcing them to operate independently without the centralized coordination that their doctrine required. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's refugee camps on Saturn's moons suddenly revealed themselves as sophisticated sensor networks and missile batteries, their positions carefully chosen to create overlapping fields of fire that could target any Zephyrian vessel attempting to regroup, while simultaneously jamming the alien ship's attempts to coordinate their defense using electromagnetic interference patterns based on techniques developed during Earth's electronic warfare experiments in the late 21st century. The Zephyrian flagship Eternal Dominion found itself surrounded by what had appeared to be harmless civilian vessels, but which now revealed themselves as the core of Webb's strategy, each ship equipped with boarding pods that used magnetic grappling systems originally designed for asteroid mining, launching simultaneous assault teams that would capture key Zephyrian personnel rather than attempting to destroy ships that were far superior to anything humanity could build. Webb had studied the tactics of Francis Marion, the swamp fox of the American Revolution, understanding how smaller forces could defeat larger armies by refusing to fight according to the enemy's expectations, instead using mobility, deception, and intimate knowledge of the terrain to turn every engagement into an ambush where superior numbers and technology became meaningless. Admiral Zektar's confusion was evident in his increasingly frantic communications as he tried to understand how the primitive humans had managed to coordinate such a complex operation without using any of the advanced tactical networks that Zephyrian intelligence had been monitoring, unaware that Webb's forces were communicating using simple light pulses and radio bursts that mimicked the signaling methods used by naval forces during Earth's Second World War. The psychological impact on the Zephyrian crews was exactly what Webb had hoped for, as reports reached him that several alien vessels were experiencing what their commanders described as tactical paralysis, unable to respond effectively to attacks that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously while following no recognizable pattern of military doctrine. Captain Maria Santos, commanding a disguised freighter near Mars, reported successful deployment of her Trojan Horse protocols, as Zephyrian boarding parties that had captured her apparently defenseless vessel discovered too late that the entire ship was rigged with non-lethal but highly effective restraint systems, turning their own aggressive tactics against them by allowing them to capture what they thought was a prize while actually walking into a carefully prepared trap. The tide of battle was turning exactly as Webb had planned, with each Zephyrian advantage being systematically neutralized through tactics that their advanced civilization had never encountered, proving that sometimes the oldest strategies were the most effective precisely because they were so ancient that no modern military mind would think to defend against them. Admiral Zektar's fleet, which had seemed invincible just hours earlier, was now scattered and confused, their crews discovering that all their technological superiority meant nothing when faced with an enemy who understood that true warfare was about outthinking your opponent rather than simply overpowering them, setting the stage for the next phase of Webb's campaign where the Zephyrian Council would learn that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't any advanced technology, but rather the accumulated military wisdom of 5,000 years of human conflict. Using Hannibal's double envelopment tactics adapted for space warfare, Webb began systematically isolating individual Zephyrian vessels from their fleet, implementing the same strategic masterpiece that had destroyed the Roman legions at Cannae over 2 millennia ago, except now the battlefield stretched across multiple planetary orbits and the killing ground was the cold vacuum of space itself. Admiral Zektar's flagship found itself at the center of what appeared to be a chaotic melee, but Webb knew that every movement of his scattered forces was part of a carefully choreographed dance designed to draw the Zephyrian fleet into an increasingly tight formation where their superior firepower would become a liability rather than an advantage. Captain Jennifer Walsh, commanding the converted mining vessel Iron Phoenix near Venus orbit, executed her portion of the envelopment by appearing to flee from 2 Zephyrian destroyers, leading them directly into the path of Captain Robert Chen's concealed weapons platform, which had been masquerading as a damaged space station broadcasting automated distress signals for the past 18 hours. The genius of Webb's adaptation lay in his understanding that space warfare, like ancient ground combat, was fundamentally about controlling movement and dictating the terms of engagement, using the three-dimensional nature of orbital mechanics to create the same effect that Hannibal had achieved with terrain and timing on the plains of southeastern Italy. Commander Angela Torres reported from her position behind Europa that the Zephyrian heavy cruiser Stellar Vengeance had taken the bait, pursuing what appeared to be a limping refugee transport into a carefully prepared kill zone where 3 of Webb's disguised vessels could converge simultaneously, their mining equipment repurposed into weapons that could disable alien systems without triggering the automatic defense protocols that protected against conventional military technology. Webb watched his tactical display with the same cold calculation that had made Hannibal one of history's greatest military minds, understanding that the key to victory lay not in defeating the enemy's strengths but in forcing them to defeat themselves through their own tactical assumptions and cultural blind spots. The Zephyrian doctrine emphasized maintaining formation integrity and mutual support between vessels, principles that had served them well in their conquest of 47 worlds, but which now made them predictable as Webb's forces systematically eliminated their ability to communicate and coordinate, turning each proud warship into an isolated target that could be dealt with individually. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Phillips, piloting a disguised cargo hauler through the asteroid belt, activated the second phase of the envelopment as he began herding 3 Zephyrian escort vessels toward what they believed was empty space, but which actually contained a network of kinetic mines that Captain David Rodriguez had been carefully positioning for the past 2 days using construction equipment that appeared on alien sensors as harmless civilian machinery. Admiral Zektar's growing desperation was evident in his increasingly frantic attempts to re-establish fleet cohesion, but every order he transmitted was either jammed by Webb's electronic warfare specialists or intercepted and used to predict the next phase of Zephyrian tactical movements, giving the human forces an almost supernatural ability to anticipate and counter every alien maneuver before it could be completed. The psychological impact of the envelopment was just as devastating as its tactical effects, as Zephyrian crews who had expected to face desperate but predictable resistance instead found themselves confronting an enemy that seemed to know their every move in advance, creating the same sense of helpless inevitability that had broken Roman morale when they realized they were trapped in Hannibal's killing field. Captain Lauren Bennett's task force executed the final phase of the left envelopment by revealing that the damaged Earth defense satellites that the Zephyrians had dismissed as obsolete technology were actually sophisticated decoys, each one concealing a boarding pod loaded with specially trained human marines equipped with non-lethal weapons designed to capture rather than kill, turning the alien crew's own ships against them through the ancient military principle of using superior numbers against divided forces. Webb's masterstroke became apparent as the envelopment tightened around Admiral Zektar's core fleet, each Zephyrian vessel finding itself cut off from support and facing multiple attackers who seemed to materialize from nowhere, just as the Roman legions had discovered when Hannibal's Carthaginian forces closed the trap that would become the template for tactical genius studied in military academies for the next 2,000 years. The Zephyrian admiral's crystalline features reflected not just surprise but a growing understanding that he had been outmaneuvered by an enemy he had dismissed as primitive, his advanced technology rendered useless by tactics so ancient that his civilization's military computers had no protocols for defending against them, setting the stage for the next phase of Webb's campaign where the hunter would become the hunted and the supposedly superior alien council would learn that true military genius transcended technological advancement. The Zephyrian Council's confidence crumbled as Webb employed psychological warfare techniques from Earth's history, turning their own rigid hierarchy against them by broadcasting carefully crafted messages that exploited the fundamental cultural divisions within the alien command structure, using principles that Sun Tzu had outlined in his treatises on warfare and that had been refined through centuries of human conflict from the Mongol invasions to the Cold War intelligence operations. Admiral Zektar's crystalline features began showing visible stress fractures as reports reached him that several of his subordinate commanders were questioning his tactical decisions, their doubt carefully cultivated by Webb's transmission of intercepted Zephyrian communications that had been selectively edited to make it appear that the Council's high command was already discussing Zektar's replacement due to his failure to quickly subdue the primitive human forces. Captain Nicole Turner, operating from her concealed position in the Kuiper Belt, activated the psychological warfare protocols that Webb had developed after studying the propaganda techniques used during Earth's Second World War, broadcasting on Zephyrian military frequencies what appeared to be internal council communications discussing the admiral's incompetence and the political consequences of his failure to deliver the swift victory that had been promised to the galactic community. The beauty of Webb's psychological assault lay in his understanding that the Zephyrian military culture was built on rigid adherence to hierarchy and absolute confidence in technological superiority, making them uniquely vulnerable to attacks that undermined their command authority and questioned their fundamental assumptions about their own invincibility. Commander Brian Washington reported from his position near Neptune that the Zephyrian destroyer Crystal Talon had experienced what appeared to be a mutiny, with junior officers attempting to override their captain's orders after receiving what they believed were updated tactical directives from the Council, when in reality they were responding to carefully forged communications that Webb's team had crafted using captured Zephyrian encryption codes and cultural knowledge gained from decades of diplomatic contact. Webb had studied the techniques used by the Office of Strategic Services during the Second World War, understanding how psychological operations could be more devastating than direct military action when properly applied against an enemy's cultural weaknesses, and the Zephyrian obsession with honor and hierarchical authority made them perfect targets for the kind of disinformation campaign that had historically turned Allied forces against each other. Lieutenant Colonel Jessica Hayes, commanding a network of hidden communication relays throughout the outer system, began Phase 2 of the psychological campaign by transmitting what appeared to be emergency council directives ordering individual Zephyrian commanders to retreat to specific coordinates for strategic regrouping, effectively scattering the alien fleet while making each captain believe they were following legitimate orders from their superiors. The psychological pressure on Admiral Zektar intensified as Webb's operatives fed him a steady stream of false intelligence suggesting that other Zephyrian fleets had suffered similar defeats against human forces, playing on the alien commander's deepest fears about his reputation and career while simultaneously making him question whether humanity possessed military capabilities that the Council's intelligence services had failed to detect. Captain Anthony Garcia's specialized team activated their most devastating psychological weapon, a carefully constructed holographic message that appeared to come from the Zephyrian Supreme Council itself, expressing deep concern about Zektar's tactical failures and ordering him to maintain radio silence while they evaluated his performance, effectively isolating the Admiral from any real communication with his superiors while leaving him to question whether he still had their support. Webb understood that the Zephyrian military mindset, shaped by millennia of technological dominance, was fundamentally unprepared for the kind of psychological warfare that humans had perfected through centuries of conflict, asymmetric warfare, and intelligence operations, making the aliens particularly vulnerable to tactics that attacked their confidence rather than their ships. The cumulative effect of the psychological campaign became apparent as Zephyrian fleet cohesion completely broke down, with individual commanders making increasingly desperate decisions based on incomplete information and growing paranoia about their standing within the Council hierarchy, exactly the kind of command breakdown that Webb had observed in historical accounts of military organizations that had been subjected to sustained psychological pressure. Commander Patricia Miller reported that 3 more Zephyrian vessels had abandoned their assigned positions, their captains apparently convinced that they were following secret orders to establish independent defensive perimeters, when in reality they were responding to Webb's manipulation of their own cultural conditioning about obedience to authority and fear of punishment for failure. Admiral Zektar's growing desperation was evident in his increasingly erratic communications, as he tried to regain control of a fleet that was disintegrating not through direct military defeat but through the systematic destruction of trust and confidence that held the Zephyrian command structure together, proving that Webb's greatest weapon wasn't any advanced technology but rather his deep understanding of how psychological pressure could turn an enemy's strengths into catastrophic weaknesses. The stage was now set for the final confrontation, where Webb would force Admiral Zektar to choose between sacrificing his honor or sacrificing his fleet, a decision that would demonstrate once and for all that humanity's greatest advantage in interstellar warfare wasn't their technology or their numbers, but their intimate understanding of the psychological factors that determine victory and defeat in any conflict between intelligent beings. In a desperate gambit reminiscent of the Battle of Thermopylae, Webb positioned the Defiance to make a final stand while his hidden forces prepared the killing blow, broadcasting on all frequencies what appeared to be humanity's last defiant message as he maneuvered his lone frigate directly between Admiral Zektar's remaining fleet and Earth itself, creating the same tactical situation that had made King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans legendary for their sacrifice against impossible odds. Admiral Zektar's crystalline features brightened with what Webb recognized as the alien equivalent of satisfaction, as the Zephyrian commander finally believed he had forced the elusive human captain into a conventional engagement where superior firepower and numbers would guarantee victory, exactly the kind of climactic battle that Zektar's military training had prepared him to win. Webb's communications to his scattered forces took on the tone of a commander issuing final orders, each transmission carefully crafted to sound like the desperate instructions of a leader who had exhausted all other options and was now preparing to sacrifice himself and his crew to buy Earth a few more precious hours, when in reality every word was a coded signal activating the final phase of a strategy that combined elements from Thermopylae, the Battle of the Alamo, and Custer's Last Stand. Except this time the apparent sacrifice would serve a very different purpose. Captain Michael Rodriguez, concealed behind one of Jupiter's smaller moons, received Webb's coded transmission and began the final repositioning of his task force, understanding that his role was to play fealties to Zektar's Xerxes, appearing to betray the human cause by revealing what seemed to be a secret passage around Webb's defensive position, when in fact he was leading the Zephyrian fleet directly into the most devastating trap in military history. The Defiance's weapons powered up with dramatic energy signatures that Zephyrian sensors could easily detect, Webb's tactical display showing him deliberately targeting his ship's most powerful systems to create the kind of massive electromagnetic pulse that would announce to every alien vessel in the system that humanity's last guardian was preparing to go down fighting, while simultaneously masking the much subtler energy signatures of the dozens of hidden weapons platforms that were now moving into their final attack positions. Webb opened his grandfather's book one last time to the passage about the Hot Gates, where Leonidas had chosen to die rather than retreat, understanding that sometimes the greatest victory required the appearance of ultimate sacrifice, except that Webb's death would be carefully stage-managed to achieve something that the real Spartans could never have imagined, the complete destruction of an enemy force that believed itself invincible. Admiral Zektar took the bait exactly as Webb had predicted, ordering his remaining ships to form a massive assault formation that would overwhelm the lone human frigate through concentrated fire, his tactical computers calculating firing solutions that would reduce the Defiance to atoms while demonstrating Zephyrian superiority to any human observers who might still be watching from Earth's surface. Commander Lisa Martinez, operating from her concealed position in the asteroid belt, watched as the Zephyrian fleet consolidated into the tightest formation they had maintained since arriving in the solar system, their commanders so focused on delivering the killing blow to Webb's ship that they failed to notice the dozens of seemingly inactive mining platforms and abandoned cargo haulers that were now moving slowly but purposefully toward attack positions around their flanks and rear. The psychological impact of Webb's apparent last stand was exactly what he had hoped for, as Zephyrian crews who had been demoralized by days of unexpected human resistance now focused all their attention on the satisfaction of finally destroying the enemy commander who had humiliated their supposedly superior forces, their entire fleet committed to a single overwhelming assault that would leave them completely vulnerable to the counterattack that Webb had been preparing since the moment the alien ships first appeared in Earth's solar system. Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Thompson reported from his position near Saturn that all hidden weapons platforms were in position and awaiting the final activation code, each one disguised as harmless civilian equipment but actually carrying enough firepower to cripple a Zephyrian capital ship, their targeting computers locked onto the engine systems and command centers of every alien vessel in Zektar's fleet. Webb's final transmission to Admiral Zektar was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, challenging the alien commander's honor while simultaneously goading him into making the one tactical mistake that would seal his fate, using the same kind of personal insult that had driven Xerxes to throw away his numerical advantage in pursuit of a dramatic victory over the defiant Spartan king. The Defiance shuddered under the first volley of Zephyrian fire as Webb's ship began what appeared to be its death throes, smoke and flame erupting from carefully prepared pyrotechnic charges that would convince any observer that humanity's last hope was dying in a blaze of futile glory, while in reality every system aboard the frigate remained fully operational and ready to participate in the devastating surprise that would prove once and for all that sometimes the oldest tricks were still the most effective ones. Admiral Zektar surrendered his entire fleet, finally understanding that humanity's primitive nature was actually their greatest strategic advantage, forcing the Zephyrian Council to grant Earth full sovereignty and a seat at the galactic table, as Webb's carefully orchestrated deception reached its devastating climax with the activation of every hidden weapons platform simultaneously, turning what appeared to be humanity's final defeat into the most complete military victory in recorded galactic history. The moment that Zektar's fleet concentrated their fire on the apparently dying Defiance, Webb transmitted the single-coded phrase that activated dozens of concealed weapons systems throughout the solar system, each one revealing itself as Zephyrian sensors suddenly detected massive energy signatures from positions that had appeared empty just seconds before, the alien crews realizing too late that they had been surrounded by an invisible army that had been patiently waiting for this exact moment. Captain Rodriguez's betrayal completed the trap as his hidden task force emerged from behind Jupiter's radiation shadow, not to attack the rear of Webb's position as Zektar had expected, but to deliver the killing blow to the Zephyrian flagship's engines and communications array, effectively decapitating the alien command structure while leaving the crew alive but completely helpless. Webb's ship suddenly ceased its death throes as the Defiance's holographic projectors shut down, revealing that the smoke and flames had been an elaborate illusion designed to draw every Zephyrian vessel into optimal firing position, the frigate's actual condition pristine and ready for combat as Webb himself appeared on Admiral Zektar's communication screen with a smile that combined satisfaction with genuine respect for a worthy opponent who had simply been outmaneuvered. The systematic destruction of Zektar's fleet took less than 17 minutes, each Zephyrian vessel disabled by precisely targeted attacks that destroyed their weapons and propulsion systems while carefully preserving life support, demonstrating the same kind of surgical precision that the aliens had used against other species. Except now it was being applied by supposedly primitive humans who had somehow anticipated and countered every aspect of advanced Zephyrian military doctrine. Admiral Zektar's crystalline features reflected not just defeat but genuine amazement as Webb explained how every phase of the battle had been based on military strategies developed thousands of years before the Zephyrian civilization had even achieved spaceflight, proving that tactical genius was not dependent on technological advancement but on understanding the fundamental principles that governed conflict between intelligent beings. The political ramifications of Webb's victory rippled throughout the galactic community as news spread that a single human commander had not only defeated a Zephyrian Council fleet but had done so using tactics that predated most galactic civilizations, forcing species that had dismissed humanity as primitive to reevaluate their assumptions about the relationship between technology and military capability. Webb's final communication to the Zephyrian Council was a masterpiece of diplomatic psychology, offering to return Admiral Zektar and his crews unharmed in exchange for formal recognition of Earth's sovereignty and a permanent seat on the galactic governing body, while simultaneously making it clear that humanity possessed military capabilities that could threaten any species that attempted to treat Earth as a primitive world ripe for conquest. The Council's response came within hours, their representatives expressing what Webb recognized as genuine respect for an opponent who had achieved victory through superior strategy rather than superior technology, officially recognizing Earth as a full member of the galactic community with all the rights and protections that such status entailed. Admiral Zektar, in a gesture that Webb understood was deeply significant within Zephyrian culture, formally presented his ceremonial command sword to the human captain, acknowledging that he had been defeated by a superior military mind and requesting permission to study the ancient Earth texts that had made such victory possible. Webb accepted the surrender with the same dignity that his grandfather had taught him to show toward worthy opponents, understanding that true victory lay not in humiliating the defeated but in earning their respect and transforming enemies into allies who could help humanity navigate the complex political landscape of galactic civilization. The Battle of Earth, as it came to be known throughout the galaxy, became required study in military academies across dozens of worlds, with alien commanders struggling to understand how ancient human strategies could be adapted to overcome technological disadvantages that should have made victory impossible. As Webb stood on the bridge of the Defiance watching the first diplomatic ships arrive from the Galactic Council, he opened his grandfather's book one final time to the passage about winning without fighting, understanding that the greatest victory was not the defeat of Admiral Zektar's fleet but the transformation of humanity from a species dismissed as primitive into a civilization that other galactic powers would approach with caution, respect, and the kind of healthy fear that came from knowing that sometimes the oldest weapons were still the most dangerous ones.